Thank you, Malayas. Thank you for your presentation and very, you know, perhaps next time we should invite your wife, huh? As you have credited her with with coming up with this history. Just as a disclaimer, I think Mr. Topichkano will have to leave within 10 minutes or so. But we will continue. I have a few questions, and I would actually, instead of giving them to anyone, I would actually just I've coupled them together, and we have in essence we have succeeded in creating in provoking a discussion by having a title post US withdrawal. When we did that, we knew that there would be people who would actually not agree with it and possibly come up with a view that they will not withdraw, which is personally also my view. They won't do that, especially not the 1st of May. But I've coupled a few questions, and anyone can take them on. We have a lot of people from the region, especially the region of India, Pakistan, and Kashmir. So there are a few questions related to that. I'm going to couple them so that anyone can answer. One is, what will this Afghan war and the situation in Afghanistan, will it, and if so, what impact will it have on the issue of Kashmir? The second is, what is India's role, or what should India's role be in Afghanistan to deal with the Taliban and the US? And the third one, which is also related a little bit to this, is what should the US approach be to build friendly relationships between India and Pakistan, and what could it do to change the dynamics as they are in Pakistan? So anyone who would like can take, these are a bit coupled, so anyone who would like, please.
I think these questions are, all of them are addressed to Michael. What India and Pakistan on Kashmir, the issue of Kashmir, to deal with, how can India deal? I think we should have somebody from India to deal with, with the Taliban. Maybe I'll just quickly mention that, but the rest we will certainly leave it for Michael. But I wanted also to thank him with the, with the kind of analysis he came in. It, of course, was grim, and it was, I feel the chill in my bone as as an Afghan. But what he says is what we basically, to some extent, we saw from 1996 till 2001 in a different way, because I was living just around maybe 50 kilometers north of Kabul, and the area was, became from one hand to another hand, and up 2, 3, 4 times. And I remember those really horrible days of violence. To some extent, there was an ethnic cleansing, to some extent, because a number of our families were moved from Shamali to a camp in Jalalabad in 1999. And the reason was that, we have to remove people from the vicinity of 1,000 kilometers from the main road, because people from these houses, we will be attacked. But anyways, so I think that's probably, it's to some extent, it gave me some sort of, solace as an Afghan, that depth level of, understanding of what can transpire exists there in the United States. So that's I think a very positive thing. Because when I discuss some of these matters with other American colleagues or Europeans, unfortunately, they look at it in a very different optics. They're taking an optimistic view. Of course, it's good to be optimistic, but not naive. So I think that's what I wanted to thank you on that one. So on these questions of what is going to, I think we solved the main the main question of your webinar today about the terrorism trajectories in withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan. I think that's the first thing, is that certainly there won't be withdrawal in a way that you expect withdrawal, in the sense that a complete withdrawal where it will be left on its own device, we all understand, and there is a convergence that even Russia, China, to that extent, and Iran, so all countries around Afghanistan, all the regional powers, they want the United States to be out, but what they call it in a responsible way. So responsible way means that, you know, there has to be a dispensation, there have to be a peace, there have to be sort of an understanding where things will not get out of control. To be honest, now it's a burden to some extent, because I remember in 2010 and 11, when we were discussing for the first time, I was director of the Americas Division of Foreign Ministry at the time. It was just, you know, the other democratic government, Obama's government, and President Biden was the vice president. We were negotiating Afghanistan-United States strategic partnership. And part of this negotiation were that, you know, how many bases where and all of this. We had this discussion with the regional countries. I don't want to name them here. So they came in and they said, look, you know, don't think that if the United States leaves, because even at that time there was a withdrawal date on, if I can't remember, it was June or July of 2011. So that's it. I remember Ambassador Ike Berry was, you know, there, and we had to give a press conference to everyone to say that, you know, these are all conditional, blah, blah, blah. So our neighbors, major neighbors, the idea was that we are not going, nobody is going to take United States place in Afghanistan. But what we don't want to do is, it's not like, you know, today the American forces will leave, the Chinese will come in, or the Russians, or, you know, somebody else, the Indians or the Iranians. So it's a burden larger than any of the neighboring countries could take it willingly. But unwillingly, yes. Unwillingly, probably, you know, the way we've seen in Syria, where it's a very surgical approach to what they will call it counterterrorism, or maybe even state-supported non-state forces like the one in Libya and the other places. So, but that's the chaos that Michael was talking about. So the element of United States, because what we have seen, at least from the, you know, from this in the past 5-6 years, that where United States wash its hands, we have these really serious humanitarian catastrophes. Yemen and Syria are two cases in point. Libya to some extent, but, you know, again, in Libya, there are many other dynamics there. But you see there, you know, the presence of United States itself gives, you know, creates a limit to this war itself already. No one so far has shot down in NATO helicopters, although this is not a difficult thing to do it, because there is a threshold. There's a threshold as in the sense that that all the players, even, you know, the Taliban and the countries who are supporting the Taliban, they understand that it's kind of an escalation that they don't want to see. So I think the presence of US there has created a situation. While in the 1980s, Mujahideen got the stingers and shot, you know, but they didn't shoot the Russian or Soviet planes, but the governments. So I think that's one element, that it keeps this chaos to some level of control, and United States understands. So I think that's something which is very important. So with the United States there as a major player, as one of my professors in Texas A&M used to say, as a 900-pound gorilla, is that you know, it keeps things in order. Of course, you know, Russia wants one thing, China wants one thing else. What all of them they wanted, which seems that they are getting it, they get the positive signal, is that they don't want it bases from where US could project power outside Afghanistan. And we saw that, of course, that's not the intention. Bagram is there. Bagram is a huge base. Yes, you know, you can fly any kind of planes there. But I think it's something that we all understood, that this is not the intention of the United States to project power from Afghanistan. I think that's mostly for the operations within Afghanistan. So in this case, and the way this the Afghanistan study group also came in with this recommendations, so I can see that the things are, of course, slowly moving beyond May 1st. But it seems that the withdrawal, complete withdrawal, is nicely, but it's not said. I think it's sort of implicitly connected to a peaceful resolution So, and this is something that Taliban, it seems that in their internal discussions, of course, with Pakistan and the others, they came to that conclusion that it's not possible to get a withdrawal before an agreement on the peace process. So how these two are connected together and how this is kind of, roll out will be something for all of us to see. But what role can India play? I think India has to basically, in the whole of these things, stay where, as Michael said, and also the professor that taught me that in terms of, the natural ally, because if what we are doing right now in Afghanistan is we are fighting for what remains of democracy. We will say, look, a democratic governance is not a luxury for Afghanistan, it's a necessity. You can't bring any autocracy of any sort or any type in Afghanistan because it didn't work. So when I mean democracy, because a multi-ethnic, multicultural country where a democratic, basically some sort of, devolved power within, the provinces and all this will create a system where you can have Taliban in some part of it, where they are efficient in terms of tax collection or maybe some sort of regulations, implementation of regulations, but the national politics has to be a consensus-based politics. And that's why, where we had this international conference here in Geneva, I think most of the emphasis, mostly from the European colleagues, were that the basic elements of human rights, democracy, rule of law, rights of women and minorities has to be respected. And that's a kind of state that we will work with. And I think to some extent, Taliban also understands this, given their experiences of the past. So in those whole of mix, I think it's better for all the countries, including India, to be an active player and to be an active party towards democracy, rule of law, and human rights in Afghanistan. Because of course we have some other countries who are offering a different sort of state led or autocratic systems, which are a lot of them in our neighborhood. So it's not because it's not working. It's maybe some countries might think that a rule under a very autocrat mullah will work in Afghanistan. It will not work. It didn't work in 1998. It didn't work in 1999. While they had most of the power, the whole world abandoned Afghanistan. It will not work like now. I think India's role will be to move in and to bring its diplomatic, democratic credentials. I know India is facing its own democratic crisis there, but still I think it's the biggest democracy in the region, and it's a very resilient state, and it's a diverse state. I think India's role will be that, because if India isolates itself, it will be bad for India, but it will be worse for Afghanistan. Thank you.
Just quickly, before we go to Dr. O'Hanlon, I think Mr. Topichkanov, you have to leave. Well, I would like to thank you for your contribution, and well, it's a pity you cannot stay for a few questions and answers, but we'll hope to invite you next time when it will be much more convenient for you to stay a bit longer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I was delighted to be with you today, and this conversation is important, and I hope to be part of this conversation if continued. But I would like to welcome any participant who wants to ask any question or to want me to clarify my statement. Please contact me via my email. It's available online on the website of CIPRI. I will be very happy to these conversations with you. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Over to you, Dr. O'Hanlon.
Thank you. And I've got about 20 more minutes myself, by the way, but this is really a great conversation to be part of. So let me address a couple of ideas that have been raised by the callers. I know that it's not always the case that American input is appreciated in regard to Kashmir. So I'm a little hesitant to spend too much time on that topic, especially because I'm not really a Kashmir expert. But I will say that at some point, turning the practical reality on the ground into an agreement makes sense. and some kind of a division of Kashmir looks to me like the right answer, with the option of independence for either half as well. And I think India and Pakistan have too much opportunity, too much potential, too many other positive things in their futures, in their relationships with the outside world and each other, to let Kashmir forever drag them down. And so the only idea that I would add that links the Kashmir issue to our topic today, we all know the Durrani line is not really completely accepted as an international border on both sides of the Pashtun people between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So maybe there's an opportunity to have a regional conference on border clarification, and the Durran line, excuse me, and to consider the Kashmir issue and the Indo-Pakistani border issue together. And in both cases, I actually think that the logical answer is to have the official border exist where the practical border exists today. And in other words, not to do any land swaps. But there could be a benefit, and maybe there could be some cover politically so that no one views the outcome of such a conference as a concession. Of course, India might worry that by compromising on Kashmir, it has somehow given in to decades of Pakistani violence. And I don't think India would be very happy about that kind of implication. On the other hand, India has accomplished so much. It's really sort of moved beyond some of these squabbles in a sense. India is now one of the world's great powers. And I don't think it should want itself to be dragged down by this issue. In other words, I think India is now strong enough and confident enough that it can afford to compromise, even in a way that some Indians would see as a concession, and without in any way weakening its overall stature. In fact, in some ways, this would be India proving that it's not subject or hostage to the same kind of geopolitics that historically great powers have always tended to be engaged in. This would be an opportunity for India to lead the way normatively and ethically in a way that I think India often would like to, the country of Gandhi, the country of the great religions of Buddhism and Hinduism. You know, I think, not to mention Islam, I think that I would encourage Indian friends to consider this kind of an opportunity, and maybe by wrapping it in a broader regional framework that considers the peace process in Afghanistan, the Durran line between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the Kashmir question altogether. Maybe there's an opportunity for South Asia to really make a mark and take a step forward. So that's my one thought on Kashmir. I'll just offer one more observation in regard to your questions and the audience questions, and then look forward to listening to Daoud Malay's and his wisdom here again before we wrap up. But the question of power sharing is a term that we throw around a lot. And I don't really know what it means. And I think it's time for us to start having a conversation about what it means, because we know the Taliban scoff at the idea that power sharing means they will get some minor ministries. If that's what power sharing is, but President Ghani stays as president and he stays as commander-in-chief of the country's security forces, for the Taliban, that's not really power sharing. And similarly, if Ghani or his affiliates had to give up the presidency and give it to the Taliban and give the control of the armed forces to the Taliban, that's not really power sharing either. That looks more like a Taliban victory. So I think we need to start getting creative. This is going to be hard. And I'll just offer a couple of provocations about some of the aspects to this question that I've tried to think about a little bit. I would also recommend Laurel Miller's study at the RAND Corporation, who tried to get at some of these kinds of questions. But again, they're ultimately questions for Afghans. So I think all we can do on the outside is just propose some ideas that have come partly from other countries, other regions, and let Afghans then decide what would work for them. One idea is to have a multi-cameral parliament. And part of parliament is elected, and part of parliament is Taliban. or maybe there are two different bodies, and the Taliban have some role in making sure that they can have an impact on any kind of legislation. Now, maybe you need a third body of parliament that's for civil society. So you don't just give the Taliban this right to have a permanent veto. You also give other parts of non-elected Afghan society an input into the process. And maybe that's one way to do it for future legislation. For the justice system, maybe there needs to be an option that you could either, if you and a party that you're engaged in a lawsuit with, if you wish, you can choose Sharia law, or you can choose government law. And you have two separate court systems. And what happens if there's a disagreement? I don't know. That's a hard question. But you could imagine having two separate court systems. A third idea would be that for the education ministry, that you have co-ministers. And one comes from the Taliban to ensure that Islam is treated as a very high priority of the state and the educational system. And another minister who works together with the Taliban, co-minister, would ensure that women and others have access, and that Afghanistan can educate its future workforce in some of the modern skills that are needed for its economy to advance. So maybe on the education question, you have to share responsibility. One last idea, and maybe the most important or the most difficult, is security. Whose military is going to be in charge? Either way, you've essentially given that side the predominant role and the potential to push out the other side. If somebody's in charge of the security forces, they have the ability to essentially have a coup and change the rules and drive away the influence of the other side, you know, essentially to do a hostile takeover and to repudiate the agreement. So I think that realistically, we cannot imagine having just a single Afghan security force right away. We need some kind of a ceasefire in place. And then I think some kind of a coordination mechanism so that Taliban continue to police certain areas, Afghan army or police patrol others, or maybe you dismantle the or rename, reconstruct the Afghan army so that someday it can become a true single national army. But in terms of policing, you have more of a National Guard concept where Kandaks from either the Taliban or the existing Afghan security forces would stay and control the areas they're currently in. I would favor a UN observation force to monitor this and report to each side with compliance reports for the other. Not an enforcement capability, but an observation force to build up confidence. And that way, both sides feel that they have some degree of fallback, that the areas that they control today are still going to be safe for their affiliates. Now, maybe the government has to give up a couple of areas to the Taliban as a show of good faith. Maybe the Afghan government keeps Kabul but gives Kandahar to the Taliban, but then you have a UN monitoring presence inside of Kandahar so that other Afghans who don't want to be dominated by the Taliban have some degree of international verification that the Taliban are handling themselves correctly in the policing role they now have in that city. I'm sorry to give you so much detail, but I'm increasingly frustrated that we talk about power sharing, but we never actually say what it means. And when you have diametrically opposite forces, a democratically elected, constitutionally based secular government on the one hand, and a caliphate-based organization on the other, both of which claim legitimacy and authority to rule the whole country, we are not very close to any kind of plausible deal on power sharing. So we're going to have to start helping this conversation forward with Americans and Afghans and everyone else who's willing to contribute. Ultimately, Afghans will have to decide. But I think it's too much to ask that this be, left only to Afghans sitting down at some summit. And we have to inject some ideas for their consideration as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Hanlon. As you said, you have to also leave within 20 minutes, and we are really wanting to end at 4 as well. So I'm just what I'm going to do, I'm going to read out 3 more questions, which are all interlinked, and then give them to actually all of you along with your final remarks and comments. And after that, we'll end. So one question is, do you think that other hardcore Islamist terrorist groups will come under pressure from a divided transnational government if US pressure would make that possible? Same related to this one is, what do you think are the challenges posed by Pakistan-based or Pakistan military-backed terrorist organizations post-US withdrawal or no post-US withdrawal? And then the third one is, do you think there could be a possible reversal in progress on women's rights over the last 2 decades, and how would that impact minorities, journalists, and human rights activists? So these are 3 questions. 2 are mostly related to terrorism, and what would that be to the progress made in other spheres on women's rights, human rights activists, minorities, journalists. So by that, I give it to all of you, and also request you all to end your answers with your last remarks you would like to have. Anyone?
I think because I'm affiliated with EFSAS, we would give our distinguished guests, the floor. So even if I have things to say, maybe Ambassador Andisha, Dr. Hano, and they can.
Thank you very much, Dawood. I just wanted to take over this women's rights, and I think one thing that we have to really make sure to protect and to preserve is the rights of women and the rights of minorities. I think this is something that probably, if we can call, quote unquote, the achievements that we had in the past 20 years, I think this is the zenith of them. Here in Geneva, I can feel and I can see that there is a real appreciation for both in the normative way of the way that we have legislated, the way we observe the women's rights and human rights in general. Of course, a war, an insurgency, a terrorist fight that we are facing brings lots of human rights violation and brutality against everyone, including human rights defenders, women, journalists, that we have seen increased in the past 1 year. But systematically, the state is supporting, and I think this is a real concern, and this is something that everybody has to try to preserve. And I think this is something also the Taliban understand, and that's why they don't have any response when it comes to this. So they will bring it in the context of the Sharia. And then when I asked them, okay, Sharia based on where? I mean, the Sharia of 1400 years ago, or what we have today in the world. So if you go from Saudi Arabia, you have the variations of application of the Islamic laws within the legislations of the countries. From Morocco to Saudi Arabia to Indonesia, you have different variations. So I think we should not be the worst when it comes to the women's rights and human rights and the rights of minorities. I think this is probably the minimum threshold that we have to keep in mind, all of us. And here in Geneva, we really fight for this. And if there's one thing the Taliban can accept, and they will be acceptable to the world, is if they respect women's rights. Thank you.
That was very well said, Mr. Ambassador. Let me just briefly comment a little bit on the other 2 questions. You were asking about Pakistani extremist groups. And I think the key point here is that we need to find a way for Afghanistan and Pakistan not to be drags on each other. As long as one is in serious conflict, the other will have spillover effects. And it's that kind of chaos that strengthens the appeal of extremist groups of whatever persuasion in whichever country. So I realize that Lashkar-e-Taiba is focused more on India, but nonetheless, the nature of the Pakistani state security apparatus and its willingness to work with extremist groups is partly a function, I believe, of whether Pakistan is taking positive steps forward as a great power with a growing economy, growing industrial capability. The Pakistan that used to be on the horizon several decades ago, when Pakistan was probably the strongest industrial and economic power in South Asia. Unfortunately, Pakistan has slipped a bit and needs to regain that kind of momentum. And that's only going to be possible if the civil war in Afghanistan can be defused rather than intensified. So I can't prove it, but my overall sense is that when Pakistan is thriving, the Pakistani people and security forces are more focused on their economic, scientific, and human development, a positive vision for the country. And there's less appeal of the extremist groups. But I would like to see attention to the Kashmir issue if possible. And again, I would encourage Indian friends to recognize just how strong their position now is in the world, just how respected they are, and therefore just how brave they can afford to be at taking a bold step for peace, even if it may be one they didn't want to contemplate in previous periods. So I think that would be my main comment in regard to your question on Pakistan and its extremist groups. And then finally, my concluding comment wrapped up in the other question. I simply believe that we are at a moment in Afghanistan where we are in no need of a rapid decision, but we do need some degree of impetus to start thinking differently. So all the talk of annual deadlines that became popular in the Biden years, the Obama years, and then carried through the Trump years, will the United States stay or go? The next deadline in 6 months or 12 months, what does that mean? That was sort of fairly pointless because it created drama, but it did not improve the quality of the debate about what ideas to advance. Now we need to get serious about what does power sharing look like. And initially, my expectation is the Taliban won't like any of the ideas that we in the West and those in Afghan civil society or government today could accept. So there's going to be a rough road ahead, and the Taliban may walk away from the peace process for a while. But ultimately, I think there are ways to create a more Islamic kind of Afghanistan that the Taliban can feel some pride and support for and be part of running if we really raise the tough questions in the peace process. So that's why I want to see and encourage as much as possible a discussion. What does power sharing really mean in terms of security, in terms of education, in terms of the courts, in terms of women's rights? And there have to be some bare minimum standards. And I also believe we're going to need to have some kind of a UN observation force to replace NATO if we ever get to that point, so that Afghans on each side of this conversation can have some confidence that the agreements that are reached are being respected by both sides. So I would like to inject that notion. It could be an all-Islamic UN observation force. It doesn't have to include Westerners, but it has to include, I think, people working for an outside entity. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Ambassador Andesha, you want to go?
You're right. Before we go, because I have something to say. On this question, because Michael has keep mentioning this question of Islam and Islamic rule and the Taliban. We had a discussion a few days back in Kabul that there are a number of group of Islamic scholars, very serious Islamic scholars, because if you do your research, Taliban does not represent serious Islamic scholars or researchers. Their idea of Islamic rule does not correspond to anything of this, neither the revivalist school, nor, the reformist schools of Islam, nor the Brotherhood. This is, a bunch of group of people of middle, we call them mullah, that's why, the few of them are Maulawis, connected to some schools where they are the third-rate Islamic schools, madrasas in Pakistan. So the question that they basically want Islam for the sake of Islam is something which is probably not very, very strong base to argue. because the discussion was among major serious scholars of Islam in Kabul, that if Taliban are really truly fighting for Islam, basically, and their idea is that things should run according to the Sharia, we will form a state which will be based on the basis of what political Islam says that you can do, not their interpretation of some half-baked madrasas in Kuwait. Then the Taliban should agree that they will not have anything to do. They can live. No, the question is not that. The question is about the question of power. If you listen to what Mullah Brother said in that hospital in Karachi, when he visited, some of his wounded people in Karachi openly, he said that, in this negotiation, we will of course gain power corresponding to your sacrifices. It's not that we will get, Islam to be implemented. No one in Afghanistan, when it comes to question of Islam, it's not that they are more Muslims or they are, very much religious scholars and the rest are not. I think the largest or the most prominent scholars of Sharia right now alive in Afghanistan is Professor Sayyaf. So if you take him in terms of, international, if we had Ayatollahs, he would have been, Ayatollahs of Sunni in the level of Sistani and the others. So this notion of, they want to be a minister of education, that he will look into the Sharia is I think these notions they have sold it. And to me, it's interesting to see that they, in all of those people, will come in and to be the defenders of Islam. You have shown me a number of really serious scholarly articles by any of the Taliban members, and then I will go and I'm a sort of not a scholar of Islam, but I've studied enough to debate with any middle rank Taliban members. I think this we have to take it out. The Taliban are fighting for Islam's implementation in Afghanistan. And I think they're fighting for power, and that's seriously clear. If you wanted to prove it, tell them that, look, don't be in the power, tell us which kind of government you want, but it should be really, approved by Azhar and the others. We will do it, and they will never do that. Thank you.
Let me just say that was very well said. I'm going to have to go because I have a class at 11 o'clock my time, but signing off with great thanks and best wishes to everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Junaid, do you want me to add a couple of things, or are we wrapping up?
Indeed, very well said at the end that this misconception that Taliban is working for Islam in Afghanistan, that's not true. It's basically power. Same goes for all those, let me just add here, for all those who sell Islam to Kashmiris in Kashmir, that's also not the case. They're also working for power. So Malaz, you, and then we'll wrap it up, but please.
Just to add a small detail to what Ambassador Andesha said, and the Taliban, one of the constituencies they've targeted, and quite ruthlessly, is the Islamic scholars and those who basically question their motives. But moving on, I'd like to add one thing about Kashmir and how the withdrawal of the US forces from Afghanistan will affect Kashmir. To listen to people like Senator Afrashev Khattak, one of the things he says that Pakistan has created an ecosystem of extremism. So it creates this energy, and the energy has to be released somewhere, be it Kashmir or Afghanistan or any other country, even Sri Lanka. So the problem is that unless you look at it from this perspective of a very structural perspective, it's difficult to say if there's no war in Afghanistan, what will happen in Kashmir, but we do know that that war will be taken to somewhere else. And Kashmir obviously is next door. What can be the US role in India-Pakistan's relation? I think one of the things that the US can do is its policy has been quite state-centric in Pakistan. Maybe
the question was also, Malaz, what can the US do to pressurize Pakistani-based, Pakistani-backed terrorism groups in the region?
Yeah, but because Pakistani states, particularly the establishment, is backing these movements, the problem is that the US approach has been quite state-centric. I mean, we've had people like General McChrystal come in and say we were fighting a network, so we had to become a network in order to fight this network. What they've lacked is to connect with some of these democratic forces in Pakistan. And right now, the political parties of Nawaz Sharif, of Zardari, and so on and so forth, they provide an opportunity for the US and anyone else to engage with. Rather than seeing Ambassador Khalizad sitting down with General Bajwa, and the only civilian present there is Mueed Yusuf, the Assistant National Security to Prime Minister Imran Khan. I mean, we all know Mueed Yusuf is very close with the army. He's more of an army man than a civilian man. So in that sense, I think US can play a role. And I think what India can do is an important thing. It's out of sync with some of the internal dynamics of Pakistan. Like right now, negotiating the ceasefire was misplaced. India should have seen that there's a lot of pressure building up inside Pakistan on the army, and they shouldn't have agreed to this ceasefire. Anyhow, the final point on power sharing, Michael provided a lot of detail in what he envisioned the power sharing. The problem is, if you look at it from the perspective of what we call the scholars of peace studies, the right moment, basically a moment where you have a mutually hurting stalemate between the warring parties. And if you define the hurting, obviously the Republican side is hurting. Maybe Ghani and his kitchen cabinet is not hurting as much as the others, but we are still hurting. When it comes to the Taliban, they are not hurting enough. And to define hurting, if the leader of Taliban loses a son to suicide bombing, that's not hurting for him. And I know from inside of the Taliban movement, there are people who are telling me we are already dyeing our beards, and that's so that we can take over Kabul. They're not preparing for peace. They're preparing for an eventual victory. That's why power sharing, like the example of Kandahar, how Kandahar can be handed over to Taliban. Come on, in Kandahar, what you have is a very strong network of people like Abdul Razak's brother and their network. They would never allow Taliban to be the dominant force there, and Taliban are not the dominant force there. Maybe in some other places. So it's a very problematic proposition. And unless you make sure Taliban are hurting the way they see hurting, I don't think. I think this process is quite premature right now. Those are my comments. Thanks so much.
Les, thank you. Just before I make my final thank you to all of you, I feel a little bit somewhere I had, the basic premise, which I really wanted also to be addressed, which we didn't do, but I think it should be said, is that we also need to take into consideration the fact that what we are discussing here, when we are discussing of giving Kandahar to the Taliban or dividing this or having a power sharing, what we forget is that we're negotiating with terrorists. And that is a premise which wasn't maybe brought out so quickly. This is the same terrorists which were sold 20 years ago as being people who killed women in public, who were very against human rights. And today we are, or actually maybe the West or maybe the Americans are advocating putting them into some kind of a power sharing agreement because they're tired of the war. Let's not forget, this would be the same thing as saying 20 years from now, let's negotiate with Al-Qaeda and give them a power sharing agreement in Sudan, or let's negotiate with Lashkar-e-Toiba and give them some kind of ministry of education where they can implement Sharia in Pakistan. So the premise remains that we're negotiating with terrorists, and that is the worst thing to do. So thank you very much all for joining. I would just, before wrapping up, as is the tradition, I would like to give His Excellency the last words, and then hopefully we all can, after this Corona is finished, we all can come together and do this in person. Thank you everyone for joining from EFSAS and from my behalf. His Excellency, I'll give you the last words.
Well, thank you very much. I think you nicely wrapped it up, and I think the subject is deep. The subject is extensive. It cannot be concluded in one or two sessions. And we Afghans, you know, we are also very talkative. We go all around because we have so many issues to discuss. And for us, it's really personal. You know, sometimes it's not very diplomatic also. So that's why we put our disclaimers at the very beginning, because we cannot stay in one topic. But I think it's important to keep talking. It's important to keep, you know, I'm hate to use this word, but I think for lack of the other phrase, educating, you know, our international audiences of what's happening, because otherwise we will come up with kind of, you know, with the kind of scenarios, with the kind of solutions, with the kind of proposals where it will create more problem than solutions. I think my concluding word would be that, you know, all societies, human beings now, the nations that we call it, they'll find a way to solve their problems if, you know, sufficient space, non-violent space is provided for them. And I think what we need from the international community, we Afghans, is that the 20 years have changed a lot in Afghanistan. If people will believe it or not, it's up to them, but we have seen it, you know, we have felt it, and it's all over the world. Afghanistan of today is not Afghanistan of 2001. Many things has changed. So what we are expecting from the international community is not the same level of, you know, investment in terms of blood and treasure, but some sort of, you know, and space for us to move from the current impasse, the current chaos that we are at. So to find a safe landing zone where we can work, because I could see things are changing. The Taliban are also not the Taliban of 2000 and the Taliban of the 1990s. Yes, because ideologically they understand this is the way that they can mobilize their people. As you rightly said, or the terrorist group, because mobilizing on the basis of religion is the easiest political mobilization. You will not give people, you know, job, you will not give people money, you will not give them food, you will not give them checks, you just tell them that you will go to heaven or you go to hell. I mean, what? This is the great politics. But then the space, we need this space, we need this safe landing, and we will solve it among ourselves. Yes, it will be chaotic. Who say that it's easy? But we need the space, and that space is something that, you know, I could see that the world is looking into, to have that space for Afghans to work among themselves, to find a solution, to move forward, and that needs time. I think 20 years or maybe 18 years in terms of, you know, putting or solving a problem which is brewing in that part of the world for now. Let's say from the time of the British takeover of the region is not a great time. Just a small thing, and I think we need just a generation turnover to solve the problem in Afghanistan. If they do it sort of, you know, a half-baked thing, if the United States or our international friends, they wanted to bring us back to 2001 because they thought that, you know, we are tired, as you said. I think again we have to go to this vicious circle for another century. And I think 21st century should be a different century for Afghanistan. The beginning was good, and I hope that we can pass this hurdle of 2021, 2022. And with this, I thank you very much. I thank the Institute. I thank you all. I thank Dawood for organizing this, and a great evening for everybody.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dawood, and best of luck. We'll meet soon. Thank you.